Imagine walking into a friend's apartment in Moscow circa 1982, peeling off your heavy coat and looking around at the items that fill their living room, from the crystal vase on the sideboard to the rug on the wall and the heavy Polish cabinetry in the corner. To the untrained eye, it looks like a standard, somewhat cluttered domestic scene. But to you, a Soviet citizen, this isn't just a room. It is a trophy case of impossible victories against a broken system where every object represented a battle won. Have you ever looked at a gadget or a piece of furniture in your own house and remembered the exact struggle it took to buy it? Or do you just remember clicking add to cart and waiting for the doorbell to ring? In the USSR, every single object had a biography, a saga of bribes, waiting lists, and secret handshakes that transformed the act of shopping into a high-stakes tactical operation that could take months or even years to complete. The Soviet Constitution guaranteed the right to work, but it said absolutely nothing about the right to buy a decent pair of boots, creating a society where money was abundant but things were scarce, and where the most valuable asset you could have wasn't a bank account but the cunning ability to navigate the maze. The shops were technically open and the prices were fixed low by the state, but the shelves were barren, leading to a unique economic paradox where the problem wasn't affordability, it was availability, forcing you to ask a question that defined your entire existence. Not can I afford it, but where can I find it?
This scarcity gave birth to a specific vocabulary that rewired the human brain, specifically around the verb dostavat, which doesn't mean to buy, but to obtain, to get a hold of, or to drag out. When you went to the store in the West, you were a consumer, exercising a choice. But when you went to the store in the USSR, you were a hunter-gatherer, entering a hostile environment where success was never guaranteed. Think about how you feel when you go to the grocery store today. Do you feel anxiety or do you feel bored? In the Soviet Union, shopping was a source of chronic, low-level adrenaline because you never knew what you would find or if you would find anything at all. You might leave the house looking for milk and come back with a bag of light bulbs because that's what happened to be there. And you bought them because you knew that in a month, light bulbs might disappear for half a year. This scarcity mindset meant that the concept of impulse buying didn't exist. Instead, there was panic buying, where you bought things you didn't need, sizes that didn't fit, and food you didn't like, simply because it was physically present on the shelf. You became a hoarder not out of greed, but out of a rational fear of the future, turning your balcony into a warehouse of spare parts and backup supplies.
Now let's talk about the most visible symptom of this economic disease, the queue, a physical manifestation of wasted time that became a primary social institution. Imagine standing in a line that stretches for 3 city blocks in the freezing rain, shifting your weight from one numb foot to the other without even knowing what is being sold at the front. Would you join a line today if you didn't know what was at the end of it? In the Soviet Union, you joined first and asked questions later, operating on the grim logic that if people were waiting, it must be something deficit, something valuable enough to trade if not to use. The queue had its own unwritten laws, its own social hierarchy, and its own tragic arithmetic. People would write numbers on their palms in ink to hold their spot if the line was going to take days, creating a temporary community bound together by shared misery. You would make friends in the line, you would hear the latest political jokes, and you would learn to hate the people who tried to cut in. The veterans, the pregnant women, and the heroes of labor who legally had the right to skip the line. But the most terrifying moment wasn't the cold or the boredom. It was the ripple of panic that moved through the crowd when the shop door opened and a voice shouted, "They're running out! Only 2 per person!"
To survive in this environment, you needed to be armed, and your weapon of choice was the avoska, a simple, expandable mesh string bag that every Soviet citizen, man or woman, carried in their pocket or purse at all times, just in case. Do you carry a phone charger with you everywhere because you're terrified of your battery dying and losing connection to the world? The Soviet citizen carried the avoska because they were terrified of missing a sudden fleeting opportunity to feed their family. You might be walking home from work and see a truck unloading crates of oranges or frozen chickens on a random street corner. And if you didn't have a bag, you couldn't carry them, and the opportunity would vanish in minutes as the mob descended. The avoska was a symbol of eternal readiness, a humble net waiting to catch a miracle, because in a planned economy, distribution was chaotic and random. There was no marketing, no announcement. just a sudden frantic queue forming out of thin air, a flash mob of desperate consumers trying to grab a piece of the pie before it was gone. It was a life lived in a state of constant scanning alertness, where you watch the streets, not for traffic, but for the telltale sign of a cardboard box being opened.
But you didn't need to be buying a car to feel the crushing weight of the deficit. You just needed to try to put a decent dinner on the table. Enter the complex, hidden world of food distribution, where what you ate depended entirely on who you knew. Meet Ludmila, a butcher at a state-run gastronome shop, who is technically a low-level service worker earning a meager salary, but who lives like a queen compared to the university professors and doctors in her building. When the delivery truck arrives with fresh beef, the best cuts, the tenderloins, the briskets without too much bone, never make it to the glass display case where the general public can see them. Instead, they go straight into a separate locked fridge reserved for Ludmila's useful people. Do you have a guy for tickets or a hookup for discounts? And do you realize how much power that person holds over you? Ludmila trades tenderloin steaks not for money, but for services. The best cut goes to the mechanic who fixes her car, the next best to the doctor who treats her mother, and the next to the hairstylist who keeps her dyed blonde. The general public, the people who only have money, are left with the gristle, the fat, and the bone. This was the apartheid of consumption. There was one store for the common people with empty shelves, and a hidden, well-stocked store for those with connections operating in the exact same building.
For those who couldn't access Ludmila's special fridge, there was another, more exhausting option, the meat train, a phenomenon that highlights the bizarre geography of Soviet supply chains. Moscow, as the showpiece capital, was supplied with everything to keep the population happy and docile, while cities just 100 miles away were left to starve with empty shelves. Imagine if you had to take a 4-hour train ride every Saturday just to buy sausages and cheese because your local supermarket hadn't seen meat in 3 months. Thousands of people from the surrounding provinces, Tula, Ryazan, Vladimir, would flood into Moscow on the weekends, stripping the capital's stores bare, looking like an invading army armed with backpacks and string bags. They would wear their clothes in layers so they could stuff packages of butter and cheese into their pockets to save space, smelling of sweat and desperation. The locals in Moscow despised them, calling them sausage tourists, creating a deep, simmering resentment between the capital and the rest of the country. It was a daily migration driven by hunger, a massive economic inefficiency where millions of man-hours were wasted just moving food from a warehouse in Moscow to a refrigerator in Tula, only for the people to turn around and go back to work the next day.
While the adults were fighting for sausages, the youth were fighting for their identity, waging a war against the gray, shapeless uniformity of Soviet fashion. Let's go back to the streets to find a young man named Andrei who was desperate for a pair of American blue jeans, the holy grail of Soviet youth culture. Why do we care so much about brands today? Willing to pay hundreds for a logo that essentially does the same thing as a generic version. For Andrei, Levi's or Wranglers aren't just pants. They are a declaration that he is modern, that he is connected to the world, and that he rejects the baggy, grim trousers produced by the Soviet textile industry. He meets a fartsovchik, a black marketeer, in a public toilet or a dark corner of a park, inspecting the jeans with the intensity of a diamond appraiser because fakes are everywhere. He checks the zipper, it must be YKK. The stitching, it must be orange. And the fabric, it must be stiff as cardboard, paying 150 rubles, 2 months of an engineer's salary for a single pair. If the police catch him, they might cut the jeans open with a razor blade or haul him in for ideological re-education. But the risk makes the purchase even more valuable. To wear jeans was to be a dissident without saying a word, a way of smuggling the American dream onto your own body.
This thirst for Western culture extended to music, leading to one of the most creative, macabre, and fascinating workaround technologies in history: bone music. In the 1950s and 60s, Western jazz and rock and roll were banned as bourgeois corruption, but the kids wanted to hear Elvis and the Beatles. So how do you press a vinyl record when you don't have any vinyl? You use garbage. Enterprising bootleggers would raid the dumpsters of hospitals to find discarded X-ray films, thick, flexible plastic sheets with images of broken ribs, skulls, and lungs. They would use a homemade recording lathe to cut the grooves of Tutti Frutti or rock around the clock directly onto the X-ray of someone's tibia, cutting a rough circle with manicure scissors and burning a hole in the center with a cigarette. Imagine holding a record up to the light and seeing a ghostly image of a human skeleton, then putting it on a turntable to hear the muffled, scratchy sounds of American freedom. These records on ribs were sold on street corners for a few rubles, a literal fusion of death and culture that proved you can ban a product, but you cannot ban the desire for it. People will literally dig through medical waste to get what they want, creating an underground culture that was fragile, scratchy, but undeniably alive.
But what if you wanted to build something bigger, like a dacha, a summer house, in a country where you couldn't legally buy bricks, lumber, or cement because all construction materials were allocated to the state? Meet Sasha, a truck driver for a state construction company who is currently building a small cottage for his family on a plot of land the government gave him. The government gave him the land, but the stores sell zero building materials, so where does the house come from? It comes from the phantom stops Sasha makes on his delivery route. When Sasha is transporting a truckload of bricks to a massive state construction site, he pulls over on a side road, where a friend is waiting with a car and a trailer. They quickly offload 500 bricks, just enough that the foreman at the big site won't notice, or won't care because he's doing the same thing. Sasha isn't stealing in his mind, he is carrying out, a linguistic distinction that Soviet people used to justify theft from the state. The state is rich, they would say, and the state is us, so I am just taking what is mine. Every private house in the Soviet Union was built with stolen materials, a monument to the ghostly diversion of state resources, where the official economy was cannibalized to build the private one.
This philosophy of carrying out became so pervasive that factories had to employ guards to search workers leaving their shifts, but the guards were often in on the scheme too, taking a cut of loot. Think about office supplies you might have taken home from work, a pen, a notepad, and multiply that by an entire industrial economy. Workers at a glass factory would wear oversized coats to smuggle out crystal vases. Workers at a meat processing plant would wrap sausages around their torsos like a meaty belt to walk past security. Workers at a distillery would fill condoms with vodka and tape them to their legs. There was a famous joke from the era. A worker pushes a wheelbarrow full of straw out of the factory gates every day for 20 years. Every day, the guard searches the straw, finds nothing, and lets him pass. On the day of his retirement, the guard asks, "I know you were stealing something all these years. What was it?" The worker smiles and says, "Wheelbarrows." This wasn't just a joke. It was a reality where the system was so focused on the detailed accounting of the contents that it missed the vehicle. The black market was often just the act of repurposing the state's own infrastructure for personal gain, turning the factory into a personal supply depot. Let's talk about the ultimate symbol of Soviet success and the ultimate headache of Soviet life, the private automobile. Meet Tanya, a chemical engineer in Novosibirsk who has been saving her rubles for 5 years to buy a Zhiguli, the Soviet version of a Fiat. But she faces a mathematical impossibility that would make a modern economist weep. The official price of the car is about 6,000 rubles, which is expensive but affordable for her family. But the waiting list to actually receive one is 7 to 10 years long. Can you imagine walking into a dealership today to buy a Honda and being told to come back in 2035? Tanya knows that by the time her name comes up on the list, the model will be obsolete. Or she might be too old to drive, so she is forced into the gray market where the laws of economics are inverted. She finds a man selling a used Zhiguli with 50,000 kilometers on the odometer, and the price is 15,000 rubles, nearly triple the cost of a brand new one. In the Soviet Union, a used car was worth more than a new one because the used car actually existed and you could drive it away today. Tanya pays the extortionate price, depleting her family's life savings, realizing that in a deficit economy, time is the only commodity more expensive than goods. And once you had the car, the struggle didn't end. It just changed form, because now you had to maintain it in a country with no spare parts.
This created a unique male subculture centered around the garage, which was less of a parking spot and more of a private club, a sanctuary away from the crowded apartment and the nagging wife. Men would spend their weekends in these metal boxes, not just fixing their cars, but brewing moonshine, pickling vegetables, and trading spark plugs like currency. If your windshield wiper was stolen, a common occurrence because they were removable, you didn't go to a store to buy a new one. You stole one from someone else's car, continuing a cycle of petty theft that circled the entire nation. Or you went to your garage neighbor who worked at a metal plant and asked him to machine a custom wiper blade arm for you out of scrap titanium. The Soviet garage was a hotbed of innovation, where people learned to fix anything with nothing, keeping cars running for 30 years using duct tape, pantyhose, which was used as fan belt, and sheer will. It was a place where the Soviet man could finally feel a sense of control over his environment, ruling over a kingdom of rust and oil.
But perhaps the most absurd example of the shortage economy was the salon for newlyweds. In the USSR, even love was regulated by the deficit. If you wanted to get married, you needed a white dress, a suit, gold rings, and food for a banquet, none of which were available in normal stores. However, once you applied for a marriage license at the registry office, the state gave you special coupons to access a salon for newlyweds, a magical store that was actually stocked with goods. This led to a rampant scam where friends would apply to get married with no intention of actually going through with it just to get the coupons. They would go to the salon, buy the shoes, the suit, the sheets, and the vodka, and then simply break up before the wedding date. The state was inadvertently incentivizing fake romance just to distribute towels. Imagine a world where you have to pretend to be engaged just to buy a decent set of bed sheets. It turns the most intimate human connection into a commercial transaction, forcing you to leverage your personal life against the economic reality.
However, there was an even higher tier of shopping that was completely forbidden to 99% of the population, a place that felt more like a hallucination than a retail store. These were the berioska stores, specialized shops that didn't accept Soviet rubles at all, but only accepted foreign currency or special certificate rubles issued to diplomats, sailors, and the elite. Imagine walking past a store in your own city where the windows are clear, the lights are bright, and you can see Toblerone chocolate, Japanese tape recorders, and American cigarettes. But if you try to walk in, a guard blocks your path. This is the reality for Boris, a high-ranking official in the Ministry of Trade, who walks into a berioska and is greeted by the smell of real coffee and French perfume, scents that don't exist on the street outside. In here, Boris can buy a VCR, a pair of Adidas sneakers, or high-quality vodka without waiting in line, using the special certificates he earned working overseas. The berioska was a slap in the face to the communist ideal of equality, a glowing temple of capitalism built by the state itself to satisfy the hunger of its own elite. The existence of these stores created a dual consciousness. Everyone knew the West was the enemy, yet the enemy's goods were the ultimate status symbol, creating a society that publicly hated the West but privately worshipped its trash.
This constant need to obtain things changed the very nature of friendship in the Soviet Union, turning social circles into supply chains. You couldn't just be friends with someone because they were funny or kind. You had to subconsciously assess their utility. A doctor was a valuable friend, a store manager was a gold mine, a taxi driver was useful, but a philosopher or historian, they were useless in the economy of shortages. Imagine looking at your contact list on your phone right now and ranking your friends not by how much you like them, but by what they can get you. This mercenary mindset eroded social trust, creating a circle of us versus them. You helped your circle and you screwed everyone else. If you were a cashier, you shortchanged the stranger to save money for your friend. It was a survival mechanism that atomized society, making corruption the only social glue that held anything together. It forces us to ask a difficult question. Does hardship make communities stronger, or does it just make them more conspiratorial?
Even intellectual life wasn't spared from the deficit. Books were incredibly scarce, leading to a bizarre program called makulatura.
Since the state couldn't print enough popular books like The Three Musketeers or Queen Margot, they set up a system where you could trade 20 kilograms of waste paper, old newspapers, magazines, cardboard, for a coupon that allowed you to buy one rare book. Imagine a nation of people hoarding their trash, stacking piles of old newspapers in their tiny hallways, not to recycle, but to read Alexander Dumas. People would steal cardboard from the back of stores, weigh their own trash on scales, and trade entire forests of propaganda newspapers for a single adventure novel. It showed that the hunger wasn't just for food or jeans, it was for escapism, for a story that took you away from the gray reality of the queue. Books were displayed on shelves like jewels, not just as literature, but as proof of the physical labor it took to acquire them. A bookshelf in a Soviet home wasn't a library, it was a weightlifting record.
By the late 1980s, the shelves were empty not because there was no production, but because the distribution system had completely collapsed into the black market. Goods were being produced, but they were instantly siphoned off into the trunks of cars and the back rooms of stores before they ever hit the shelves. The state price became a fiction. The market price was the reality. When the Soviet Union finally fell, it wasn't just a political collapse. It was the formal recognition of the economic reality that people had been living in for decades. The black market didn't take over. It just took off its mask. The transition to capitalism was painful, but for many, it wasn't a shock because they had been functioning as capitalists in secret for their entire lives. The skills that Tanya, Andrei, and Sasha developed, the hustling, the trading, the networking, became the foundational skills of the new Russian economy. The tragedy is that the system forced honest people to become crooks just to survive, blurring the line between morality and necessity until it vanished completely.
So the next time you tap your phone to order dinner or walk into a supermarket with 50 varieties of cereal, pause for a second. Think about the immense invisible luxury of availability. Think about Tanya driving her overpriced used car, Ludmila hiding the best steaks, Andrei risking prison for a pair of jeans, and the music pressed onto the bones of strangers. The story of Soviet consumption is a lesson in the resilience of human nature, that no matter how rigid the system, people will always find a way to improve their lives, one bribe, one favor, and one secret purchase at a time. It leaves us with a final provocative thought. In a world of abundance, we often feel empty, but in a world of emptiness, every object meant everything. Does the ease of getting what we want today make us value it less, or are we just lucky to not have to fight for a pair of socks?